I'm going through chapter 5 of this book, Thinking in Systems, and the title of the chapter is System Traps and Opportunities. I didn't include opportunities up there because a lot of these are very deeply entrenched problems in systems. And while I do think it's important to keep things hopeful, I think calling these opportunities is just a little bit beyond the pale. So all of these are things that are known to economists, but what I'm actually going to do in this video is sort of go through these one by one and give one of the examples from her book and try to visualize it using her system of stocks and flows and feedback loops. Because, of course, it's the same concepts as in economics, it's just we're thinking about it from a slightly different perspective. So the 8 traps she comes up with are policy resistance from the population when policymakers implement a policy, tragedy of the commons, that comes from economics, drift to low performance, escalation, success to the successful, which exacerbates inequality, of course, addiction, rule beating, or going with the letter of the law rather than the spirit of the law, and seeking the wrong goal. Okay, so first one is policy resistance. And the example she gives in the chapter is a country that's trying to increase their population because maybe people have just stopped having babies in that country, and that creates economic problems down the line. So the policymakers may come in and try to pass a policy that bans abortion with the intention of increasing birth rates. And birth rates, of course, are flow. The population is the stock, so let me just label that. And one thing I want to note when it comes to feedback loops is that feedback loops actually influence flow. So this is actually not different than that flow. We keep in mind that there are a lot of different types of flow in and out of the population. There's death could be one flow. I could write another arrow and say emigration to other countries is another type of flow that matters. So lots of types of flow exist, and the feedback loops sort of act as part of the flow. So in this case, the abortion rate is meant to, by banning abortion, that's meant to create this positive feedback loop that's going to increase the population. It's intended to, at least. But there is going to be instead a balancing feedback loop that when you pass the abortion law, the population doesn't like that, so they will take all kinds of effort to resist that law. That means there's going to be underground abortions. That means there's going to be all kinds of, like an increase in other types of birth control. There's going to be all kinds of population responses to try to resist it. And that means this feedback loop that was supposed to increase the population, because of that resistance, that's actually going to sort of pull the population back to what it used to be. And so the feedback loop that was intended to change the size of the population ends up not working. And her 2 solutions to this one are, for one, to let go. Like if there's a whole bunch of resistance to policy, a lot of times that resistance becomes deeply entrenched, and that can make things actually worse than even they were before the law went into place. So she says let go, and then try to develop policies that are aligned with the incentives of the population. So her example in that case was maybe in a country people weren't having children because they were in really small living quarters, and having children in a 1-bedroom apartment isn't great. So you could create policies that enable people who have children to move to bigger houses or whatnot, subsidize bigger houses for people who have babies. And that would be better aligned with people's incentives, such that the feedback loop had more of a chance of sort of getting going to increase the population, rather than creating all of this resistance from the population. Okay, so we have the tragedy of the commons, and the classic example there is the fish population in a pond or in a lake where the fishermen are all fishing out too many fish, such that the population of fish is becoming smaller and smaller and smaller, and eventually may go away if people don't limit how many fish they take out of the pond. Because of course fish are a renewable resource, so to make sure that renewable resource is sustainable, you need to make sure people aren't fishing out too many to keep the population up to date or keep the population going. That's the tragedy of the commons, because the individuals sort of acting out of their own self-interest and eating as many fish as they want end up using up the resource for the entire population. Now, the entire population is also engaging in this. It's people sort of individually optimizing their own utility, and that leads to a situation where the population is disadvantaged collectively. That's the tragedy of the commons. Now, the feedback loop you would want is some feedback loop where if the fish population started to shrink too much, you would want some feedback loop where the population sort of noticed there was a problem and did something to address it, to bring that fish population up or to limit people's overuse of the fish. And what could this feedback loop be that will stop the stock of fish from shrinking naturally due to the tragedy of the commons? Well, she gives a couple of solutions, which are also solutions that economists talk about. Her solutions are to educate and exhort, to privatize the commons, or to regulate. And educate and exhort would mean sort of making sure everybody in the population knew that if we all fish too much, then we're all going to starve once the fish population is used up. And exhort is basically shame and make people feel some kind of social incentive that they want to be community players and only fish the amount that's sustainable for the population. That's the educate and exhort solution. Privatize the commons, and that whoever owns that lake has an incentive to put in place whatever essentially regulations and whatever extortions need to be in place to make sure that the lake is producing fish year after year. And then of course the final one is regulate as government. The next trap is the drift to low performance trap. And this is something that happens a lot with, say, government agencies, where there's a certain amount of effort expected of people in the agency, but how do you keep people's effort up? How do you sort of let them know they're above standard or below standard, or give them a kick in the pants to get them moving? Well, a lot of times they figure out how much effort they need to put forward by comparing themselves to others. So there's a feedback loop where they put forth effort, they wonder, is this worthwhile? And if they have an information loop where they're sort of comparing themselves to others, and they end up comparing themselves to people putting forth less effort, that feedback loop is going to say, okay, actually I don't need to put as much effort in. That's going to reduce the stock of effort, and that can lead to this sort of spiral downward in performances. And part of this is due to sort of ego, that we tend to prefer to compare ourselves with people putting forth less effort. We tend to be more skeptical about people who are high performers. We come up with excuses like that's probably not real. They probably are exaggerating how well they're doing. And because of this natural sort of tendency of the human brain to interpret the world in ways that boost our own ego, you can get this feedback loop that leads to a decline in performance over time. Now, I will say that effort could be more of a flow variable generally, because it's something that you're sort of constantly putting forward rather than existing in a snapshot in time. But I also think you can think of effort as sort of this effort capital that might exist naturally within a company, which would be like just the natural effort people will put forward when they show up to work on a normal day. And her solution to this problem is to just make sure performance standards are high, to make sure that people are comparing themselves to top performers, and that they're not discounting those top performers performances in their own minds, that you sort of don't allow them to say, oh, that person didn't really perform that high. You say, no, actually, this is the standard we expect from people, and we're going to hold you to it. Okay, the next one is escalation, and the classic example here is two kids who get into a fight where one of them does something kind of mean and the other one has to outdo that meanness by getting back at them. The other one sort of gets back at them in a higher way, and it leads to this escalation in the fight between them. In other words, you have a stock of goodwill between the siblings, and there's a feedback loop where one of them does something small, the other has to outdo them. That shrinks the stock of goodwill, which further leads to retaliation and re-retaliation, which shrinks the stock of goodwill. And of course, this can happen between countries. This can happen between competitors if competitors are constantly trying to outdo each other with investment in research and development or with undercutting prices. And it can happen so much that companies end up losing money by undercutting each other too much. But I think the main place that escalation happens is sort of ego-driven escalation, where it's all about getting back at that other person who's shown you disrespect. There's something about the human heart that reacts strongly to provocations, and that can lead to this feedback loop. And in her solution to this, her main solution is to just not get yourself into an escalation situation to begin with. Another solution she had was to stop engaging, which works well in some scenarios, and in other scenarios, maybe the game theory doesn't quite work out that well. She also had a solution of negotiating a new equilibrium. Her next trap is success to the successful, and this happens when in a system you have a situation that may start out a little bit unequal, but there's still a lot of shared prosperity, and you have a situation where, okay, opportunity is distributed fairly equally, but then once one person or group gets a little bit of power in the system or a little bit of advantage, they use that to get more advantage for themselves in the system. And this can be the rich people sort of making sure that the private schools and the colleges that lead to the highest places in society have spots for their kids and sort of crowd out spots for other kids. And a lot of these system traps actually do relate to the concept of crowd out in economics. So if you start out with equal opportunity spread across much of the population through educational upward mobility and sort of some version of meritocracy, you can get this situation where some people get power, they're ambitious, and they use that power to expand access to their social circle and their children, and that those avenues of upward mobility that they kind of take over using their money and power that they've gained through the system, that crowds out opportunity for other people, which shrinks the stock of opportunity equity or opportunity equality. Her next system trap is addiction, dependence, or shifting the burden to the inventor. And her example here, the classic example, is the addiction example, where you have some stock of chronic pain. You would like that stock to reduce to make other parts of the system work better. And so you have some inventor, someone who comes up with a solution to this that's supposed to lead to a feedback loop that will shrink the stock. So the pain pill that inventor came up with is supposed to shrink the stock. The problem really is that it crowds out the other mechanisms in the system to address the chronic pain. So some of the mechanisms for addressing chronic pain are getting healthy, exercising, spending time with friends, spending time in nature. There are a whole bunch of things that people will do to try to naturally get the pain out of their life. Sometimes when you give them a pain pill, if that pill is addictive, the person can sort of rely on the pain pill to address the pain, especially if it works in the short term and makes the problem bigger in the long term. It crowds out these other efforts inside the system, or these other sort of natural feedback loops in the system. We might think of those other natural feedback loops as being natural ways of reducing chronic pain. This mechanism comes in and provides this alternative feedback loop that seems like it works, but instead of really working, it actually ends up making the chronic pain bigger by reducing the signal or reducing the importance or the salience of these other natural mechanisms. So the inventor was trying to solve the problem, but ended up making the problem worse by shifting the burden from the system to the person solving the problem. And this can also happen in policy. And her example was, if you have a situation where there's, say there's a country that has a poor water supply, where people are getting water from the local river or the local lake, and there's something about the water in that river that's causing disease. Well, there's going to be natural mechanisms that people use to try to clean their water. They might be filtering their water. They might be watching really carefully for bugs that they can see in the water. So those are naturally going to try to reduce the burden of disease. And you could get a situation if someone invents like a pill to treat that disease that could treat the disease in general, but it could also lead people to stop doing these other things that are really more targeted at the main source of the illness. So you can get a situation where the person that comes in with a wonderful solution ends up making the underlying cause of the problem a whole lot worse. And this is another example of crowd out, where the solution, the altruistic policymaker, is crowding out other natural parts of the system that act on a deeper place where the problem is coming from. So super common in policy. And her solution is, of course, to avoid this in the first place, especially by thinking about when you're coming up with solutions, is that solution getting at the root cause of the problem, or is that solution just relieving symptoms? And if the solution is just relieving symptoms, you're likely to end up in a situation where you're causing dependence, or else you're shifting the burden in a way that is going to make the problem worse in the long run. Her next trap is rule beating. And rule beating is basically where people end up following the letter of the law, but they don't end up really getting at the spirit of the law. And of course, the letter of the law is meant to be a feedback loop that keeps the system healthy. And systems work well when they have a bunch of different feedback loops that keep things healthy, that sort of reinforce each other. And of course, when people are rule beating, they are basically degrading those healthy feedback loops. And the example she uses in this chapter, or one of the examples, is if you have colleges or universities or departments where if they don't spend the money allocated to them by the end of the year, they lose their money. And of course, that law has great intentions. It's trying to make sure that departments only have the money that they need and that you're allocating budgets without waste. But it ends up being such that at the end of the year, if people haven't spent their money, they'll hurry up and spend on frivolous things just so that they don't lose that line item on the budget for the next year. So it actually ends up leading to more wasteful spending, which obviously is against the spirit of the law. As things change over time, you want the budget to sort of follow new trends and find where should I spend that money instead. But it ends up just getting locked up in unimportant places. And her solution to that is to revisit the rules to make sure that the rules are being followed in ways that are sort of well matched with the goals of the system. And her last system trap is seeking the wrong goal. So GDP is her example, and GDP is a flow variable. It's sort of how much productivity have we added to the economy in 1 year over the last year. And she actually says we should focus more on capital, because capital is sort of the overall stock, which is the potential for the economy, whereas GDP is just how much is it adding each year. But the problem with GDP, which is one that economists know very, very well, is that there are lots of things it doesn't capture. It doesn't capture inequality. It doesn't capture harm to the environment. There are things that could increase GDP that are really bad. Like if you have a sicker population, that could lead to more spending on healthcare, which will increase GDP, but certainly you don't want a sicker population. So there are all kinds of things that increase GDP that we would not want. And therefore, if the main thing we're sort of looking at as a signal to keep the feedback loops going positively with policy is, if that main thing is GDP, there's just so much that it's leaving out. And her solution to this is to choose your measures carefully and use multiple measures. Like, use GDP as one thing you're looking at, but also look at inequality, look at rates of addiction, look at health of the population. Happiness is a little bit, happiness is hard to measure, but you can come up with a lot of different measures that you're sort of trying to optimize when you're trying to figure out where does policy need to be changed and adjusted to sort of keep the system healthy.